So I am Nora Shanahan. Thank you to all who came tonight. It means so much to have your support. I am the student director of the Virginia Youth Climate Coalition Student Ambassador Program. And I want to give a special thank you tonight to my coordinators, Jaden Murray and Cynthia Lynn, for helping make this event possible. So as you have heard, tonight's discussion is going to be featuring Cynthia Yue, who serves a bevy of roles, including being the UN Youth Ambassador. And she has worked in so many backgrounds, and I will be going into her impressive background shortly, but she covers things like climate change, mental health, and all sorts of problems that are facing our generation today. And considering our climate background, we are going to be talking primarily about that. Get to the next page. Okay. So who are we? The Virginia Youth Climate Coalition. We started a couple of years ago as a youth-led, intersectional, pro-worker, grassroots, pro-science, all sorts of adjectives, organization that's helping to combat climate change in the Commonwealth of Virginia. We have several branches, including policy, press, scientific literature, student ambassador, outreach. So we serve many roles to help combat climate change, so we can use all of the different talents that we share to affect change. And we have done many protests. We did one in Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C. a few months ago, and that was highly successful. And we also do events like these, including like webinars and discussions with people who have a good background on the topic. And we encourage you to follow us at VA Climate on Instagram if you don't already. And we have a link tree there that brings you to all sorts of links to help you get involved with us. And that also includes our GoFundMe. I will be sharing that shortly with you all in the chat. Like I said, we are grassroots and we are youth-led, and being students who have to balance class, extracurriculars, jobs, and so forth is really hard because, we live in this world where our generation has to be at the forefront of fighting this terrible crisis. And just having that material support really helps us to function and to affect that kind of change that we want to see in the world. So your support would mean so much to us. Also, really briefly, I know I'm not the one you came to hear speak, so I'm trying to be as quick as possible. But I want to highlight the Student Ambassador Program. If these are the kinds of things that you like to do, you like to talk and meet people with great extensive backgrounds to talk about climate change, if you want to help support the movement, but also have to balance your crazy schedule of being a student, this is a really great way to get involved. We have amazing student ambassadors who have written op-eds, who have done art projects talking about climate change, who help to organize these kinds of events, all sorts of amazing stuff. And we love to give those opportunities to help people fight in the capacity that they're able to. Would love to support you, and applications are currently open, and I will be sending the link for that shortly too, and after this call. So if that is something that intrigues you, I highly suggest you join. So now I want to talk about our speaker, and then we can jump into the event. So a little about Cynthia Yue. She is the U.S. Youth Ambassador to the United Nations, a program of the UNA USA. She represents young people at the UN and has led global initiatives for sustainability, diversity, and human rights, with 8 years of experience as a former fellow at the Embassy of France, fellow at the Ministry of Tourism of the Republic of Indonesia, and UNICEF Youth Ambassador. She has reached millions of young people for international affairs. Currently, she also serves as one of 30 youth representatives in the Biden-Harris administration and MTV's inaugural White House Mental Health Youth Action Forum. So please help me in giving a nice, warm, virtual round of applause for Cynthia Yue, our amazing speaker tonight. I am now going to hand it over to my coordinator, Cynthia Lynn, who is going to be moderating tonight's discussion.
Hello, everyone. I'm Cynthia Lin, and I'd like to say thank you so much to Cynthia Yue for coming out tonight and speaking with us and answering some of our questions. So, as we know, climate change impacts the globe nationally and all across, and focusing on all populations, but specifically the youth, excuse me. Whether it may be through their mental or physical well-being, an opportunity, or through their accessibility. So in a study conducted by Blue Shield California, it actually found that 75% of Generation Z experiences some form of mental health issue due to climate change related news, but 81% still are inspired to have this kind of act and have their voices heard. So knowing this, how do we sustain this kind of movement when there is this kind of threat of a mental impact or a personal impact that is a little bit negative to their health?
That's a really great question, Cynthia. And before I begin, I just want to say thank you all so much for having me. Nora, Jaden, Cynthia, you have all done so many great things in the climate space and for activism, and just setting up this call just shows your continued dedication to this. I also want to say thank you to everybody who's joining us live and everyone who's watching this after and just watching the archive of this video, because I know that it takes a lot to give up your Friday night to want to hear about what the UN is doing for climate change. And I know hearing stories from Nora and Cynthia and Jaden, and just looking through all of y'all's amazing work on social media and online, you've done so much great work. So thank you for your dedication to this movement, because it really is young people who are leading the charge for change in this space. So with all that in mind, to answer your question, Cynthia, I think that it's really, to quote Shrek, it's like an onion, it has layers. And so the first and foremost one being that for some people, I really think that this could be a silver lining, in that I know that for me, when I see all these studies that show what's happening to our earth and how climate change is impacting us, it gives me a lot of anxiety too. And I think that we are the first generation that has had this widespread diagnosis of climate anxiety, climate change related anxiety. And so for me, when I experience this anxiety on the topic of climate change, it actually inspires me to want to do more. So seeing this 75% and 81% number, those numbers don't surprise me at all, because for me, whenever I see these things, I feel even more inspired to act, because I know that I don't like how I feel when I hear these numbers. I don't like how I feel when I hear what's happening on this planet, and it makes me want to take action. But another thing, just in general, is for everybody, and whether you are a person who is a big activist or somebody who is doing little a advocacy, I think that being sure that you're prioritizing your mental health is infinitely more important than being able, and not infinitely more important, but it's just extremely important. And the reason being is that we're students. Everybody on this call is a student, to my knowledge, and a lot of the big portion of people who are climate activists are all people in Generation Z. We are the most diverse generation of all time. There are so many things that are impacting us, including climate change. And the fact is, we can't build a strong movement if we're not taking care of ourselves too. So I would definitely say, make sure that you're seeing a therapist, talk to somebody, talk to your friends, check up on your friends, because the reality is we can't create a larger movement unless we have people who are with us and standing side by side in solidarity. So mental health is incredibly important when we think about the climate change activism space. And then finally, one last thing that I want to note is sustaining the movement through this looming threat of mental illness really requires strong unity. So again, kind of going back to my previous point, check up on people, whether it's somebody that you know personally or somebody who is also in this movement with you. I remember hearing this story from an autobiography that I read, and he talks about how he was taking a parachuting class, and they said that it's not, when your parachute falls through and you fall to the ground, it's not that initial drop that kills you. It's actually when you fall down, and then it's the second time when your body bounces back and falls through. That's what actually gets you. And the point of the story the person said was to catch people on the fall, on the bounce back. Basically, a lot of times when things hit us, whether it's a breakup or something as small as a breakup or something even larger, like a death of a loved one, initially we feel this adrenaline rush and it doesn't fully comprehend in our minds. But it's the bounce afterwards that really gets us to that point. So catch people on the bounce, make sure that you're checking up on others, and build a community, because the reality of everything, not just climate action, every single movement, is that people often come for the issues, but they stay for the people. Build a strong community, make people feel included, and ensure that you're prioritizing yourself and your mental health before you think about other things, because it takes a village to raise a child, and it also takes a village to raise awareness on an issue as critical as climate action.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and like your experiences, and also that story about the parachute. It was deeply touching, and I feel like this idea of like a community and coming together to kind of like support each other when there are these different challenging threats is definitely very, very important. I can't actually control the slides, so could Nora go to the next question, please? Okay, so a common perception that a lot of people face, and I hear from a lot of my friends, is that compared to massive companies and massive industries that do have a big impact on the environment and on climate change, how they themselves can actually change their footprint on the ecological scale. So knowing this, how do you recommend that we prevent this loss of hope, or how do we encourage this idea that what we do actually makes a change? Our voices are actually impacting the environment around us.
That's also a really great question, Cynthia. So I think one thing that I do want to know, and it's something that everyone on this call already knows, is that the biggest emitters are the companies. The sad reality is that companies are quite literally destroying our planet. The transportation industry is the largest emitter, and just in general, when we think about these awful practices that a lot of companies are doing, these unsustainable practices that are going to leave tomorrow worse off than today, it's coming from these big companies. But at the same time, there's so many things that we at an individual level do that contribute to climate change, whether for the good or for the bad. We as young people have such a critical role in preventing climate change. So on the topic of what we can do to be more sustainable, I remember doing this exercise back in high school where our teacher challenged us to carry every single piece of trash that we made that week in a plastic bag around with us, in a trash bag with us, and carry it everywhere that we went. And it is shocking at the end of the week how much trash you end up with in that one trash bag. A lot of things that you don't even realize that you're doing, because it's so, when you throw things away or when you recycle something, you don't realize what you're using. And it doesn't, the sheer amount of resources that you use every single day and every single week doesn't really play into your head. But when you see everything culminated at once, and when you have to physically carry it around with you everywhere that you go, that's when it really hits you that your individual actions actually do make a huge impact. So I would definitely recommend just doing that exercise once, just so that you can put into perspective how much waste you're actually creating. Because I remember at the beginning of the week, I thought, oh, I'm a very sustainable person. I don't produce that much trash, and I'm a 5'2" small Asian woman. What could I do? And then at the end of the week, I was just shocked by how, I mean, I think I gained so much muscles by carrying around all my trash. But jokes aside, it's really, as individuals, we do create waste. And the reality is in the same way that a room gets dirty slowly but all at once, when you forget to take care of it, that's the same impact that we as individuals have on this earth. So just keeping in mind small things that we can do, such as even showering for like 5 less minutes every single day, makes a huge impact in the long run, or producing less trash every day. That makes a huge impact. But also as individuals, there is so much that we can do to create change through our advocacy. I think probably the most influential young person who's a climate activist in our time is probably Greta Thunberg. And the reality is that she didn't do anything that is that wildly remarkable when you think about it. And I don't say this to put her down, I say this to make a point. All she did in the beginning was sit outside of Parliament with a sign that talked about climate change. All she did was tell her friends to do the same. And all she did was ask that our leaders be held accountable for climate change. And then slowly she built one of the largest movements in history for climate action, just because this 15-year-old girl sat on a set of stairs with the poster. As individuals, we can create movements that are influencing and shaping policy. And we're creating movements that are catching leaders' attentions and catching our peers' attentions. And the reality is that as individuals, one small action as simple as sitting outside of Parliament with a poster can create this domino effect that is holding people accountable and making people aware of what's going on. So again, it's in the small actions that you do to be more sustainable, but also the small actions that you do to ensure that other people feel inspired to take climate action too.
I'm so glad that you shared that exercise. I never even thought about as simple as taking a trash bag around and collecting your trash throughout the week could kind of like put that into perspective of how much trash we actually generate on the individual level. And also thank you for sharing how Greta Thunberg actually started her activism and how she kind of created this movement that really highlighted how concerned youth are on climate change as a whole. I think we're ready for the next question, Nora. So as we know, we're seeing a lot of the climate change organizations that are already set in place and are currently mobilized in across the US and across the globe. A lot of these are dominated by white and financially privileged individuals who are on the boards and who are kind of going out and enacting their missions. So how would you recommend that Gen Z kind of diversify their approach and kind of create this intersectional conceptualization of how we tackle environmentalism that addresses all viewpoints and ensures that all individuals have their voices heard?
Yeah, I mean, it's become a meme, but quite literally, part of it is just, and I have to do this too, but checking your privilege. I just being in the United States, for example, is a privilege in and of itself because there's so much mobility here in the United States and so many existing systems and infrastructure that allow us to be able to activate on these things, even just freedom of speech, being able to talk about this, freedom of assembly. There are some countries in this world where if you speak out against the government, you'll get disappeared, which is completely awful. So just understanding that we inherently have some privileges that nobody anywhere else in the world has is incredibly important, and being mindful of that to empower others who don't have the same ability to speak out and use their voices. That's super important. So part of it really is just checking your privilege. And I'm a first generation American, I'm a woman of color. And even then, I understand that there are so many privileges that I have as an activist, and just being self-aware is part of it. Another thing too is just learning to highlight other activists who are in the same space. Vanessa Nakate her story was everywhere a few years ago because she was at this science conference on climate and she stood by a row of white activists and they took the photo of all the activists and she was the only person who was cropped out of this photo. And Vanessa Nakate is right now, I think she just turned 17. She's 16 or 17 years old and she is a young Ugandan climate activist who has done so much great work in Africa to highlight how climate change is impacting her community. And her voice was silenced simply because of the color of her skin. So we really need to highlight more activists who aren't white or financially privileged. And I know that I quite literally in my previous question talked about Greta Thunberg. So I'm guilty of it too. We all like talking about Greta's story, but it's also important to highlight stories like Vanessa's that continually get shut out, and to highlight activists who don't necessarily always get the same spotlight. A big part of my term has been social justice and highlighting how we need to diversify the United Nations and diversify social movements. The reality is that a lot of BIPOCs, a lot of people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged, and a lot of people who live in the global South are the ones who are the greatest bearers of the consequences of climate change. So we need to highlight their stories. It's great being an activist, but we need to also be aware of the fact that the activism isn't about us. It's about the planet, and it's about the people that these issues are affecting the most. So understanding when it's your time to speak and when it's your time to support others, most of the time it should be the latter. Understanding when it's your time to give somebody else the microphone, that is incredibly important too.
Definitely, definitely. And kind of to build on the question and what you said, what are ways that we can like find smaller activists who may not have their voices heard, and how can we amplify them in your experience?
Yeah, activism, that's the $1 million question. So there are so many different ways, and I know, having previously had experience in the US Senate, it's our leaders' jobs to listen to people, especially their constituents. That's the most important part, because a lot of politicians, there's this joke that the ultimate job of a politician is to get reelected. Even the ones who want to actually make change and do good can only do so, quote unquote, if they are getting elected over and over again. So in many ways, it is your job in many ways to hold that person accountable. Tell them that you care about this and that this is something that matters to them. There is so much power in numbers. I remember being back in the Senate every single day. We had to tally up how many times somebody called about a particular issue and send it to the member of Congress that it pertained to. So quite literally, if you get a large group of people, and if you get enough people from who is a constituent to call in and talk about these issues, that creates the largest change. And there's actually this story with President Biden, who used to be a senator from Delaware, who once told one of his staffers that it doesn't matter if the staffer is talking to the ambassador of some big country. If somebody with a Delaware zip code calls in, hang up the phone and answer that constituent, because constituents matter a lot to politicians. Create this big movement. Get people to call your senators and your members of Congress. Get people to write letters to them, because they actually, every single letter, every single message always gets read, always gets heard, and always gets passed on to that member. It's also about just creating a grassroots movement too. Advocacy, at UNICEF, we used to say that there's big A advocacy and little A advocacy. So big A advocacy is those meetings with politicians. It's calling them and directly talking to leaders. Little A advocacy is bringing everyone together, signing petitions, talking about things in classrooms, talking about things to your classmates. Little A advocacy is just as important, because the reality is a lot of people would hypothetically support these causes, but they just don't know that they exist. Bring people together, galvanize people, and show politicians why things matter to them too. Climate change is something that affects everybody, and it should matter to, and it does matter to everybody. But the reality is some people buy X, Y, or Z arguments and others buy A, B, C arguments. So find out what makes somebody tick, what ticks somebody off, and then use those to create an argument that effectively addresses whoever your audience is.
That's great advice. Thank you. I think we're ready for the next question, Nora. Great. So I know you kind of mentioned this in the last question with kind of calling up our legislators and politicians and kind of like contacting those around us, but what other effective strategies or organizations that you know of that youth can kind of get involved with within the US or on a national and international level to be part of this kind of like global conversation? Because I know you highlight a lot of the youth concerns that you speak with and those that you get in contact with, but how can we individually kind of like speak to those on a bigger, wide scale level that we may not be, but we may not have previously have access to?
Yeah, of course. And before I answer that, I also wanted to highlight what Taylor, and please correct me if I mispronounce your name, is it Juned? I see
Oh,
that.
yeah, yes.
Okay, great. Taylor and Junid, I know that you put those into the chat, so I just want to first say thank you so much for highlighting these issues because they're things that I deeply care about too. And definitely when I said that being in America is a privilege, it's obviously not completely true. There are many things that we still need to improve on, which is why activism exists, including the Supreme Court decision that happened this morning. It's something that I was deeply disturbed by. And the shootings that happened in Texas as well. Just something in general that I want to say is it is deeply disturbing and disgusting that guns have more rights than women in this country. So I don't want to brush over that at all. And I'm so glad that you both highlighted what's happening in the United States and around the world in places like Bangladesh, where there are atrocities occurring. Thank you for being strong activists. And I just wanted to acknowledge you and let you know that I completely agree with you. And thank you for making your voice heard because it's people like you who we need in this world who are speaking about these issues in every single space. And yeah, I just wanted to
Thank you.
yeah, no, thank you. No, thank you. Thank you so much for being incredible activists. And I'm so glad that you mentioned that. And so sorry to digress, Cynthia, but to answer your question, but I really wanted to ensure that they felt like they were being acknowledged. So to answer your question, there are so many different climate organizations that you can be a part of. Fridays for Future, of course, and again, not to highlight Greta Thunberg again, but it is also one of the largest youth-led climate advocacy organizations. They organize so many great marches. The UNA USA, which is the United Nations Association of the United States of America. That one is more broadly on the United Nations as a whole, but of course there's so much advocacy with climate change that happens with the UNA USA. And the UNA USA is under the UN Foundation, which does so much great work to highlight climate action, SDG 13. So would definitely recommend. It's completely free to join. And you get so many different opportunities to engage in the climate space with the UN through the UNA USA. Also, of course, if you're looking to do more climate related things with the United Nations with a focus on children, I would definitely recommend UNICEF USA, which is where I was previously at. UNICEF USA is the United States' National Committee to UNICEF, and they specifically deal with issues that affect children. And of course, climate change is something that affects a lot of children across the globe, especially in the global south. So those are a few suggestions, but again, I talked a lot about the UN related ones, but of course there are also local climate organizations too, including the one that we're on this call for, that do so much great work on a community level that in many ways can do a lot more than the UN, especially when you bring other people in your own community together. These are conversations that can create a large momentum, even on a community scale.
Yeah, those are great organizations. I'll be sure to list all the ones that you mentioned so that our chat can go back and refer to them in the future in case. So I think you also mentioned this and touched on it a little bit earlier in one of our previous questions, but who is most affected by the impacts of climate change, and why are they the most affected, and why aren't they getting, in the case that if it is, the help that they need in these circumstances?
Yeah, yeah, so it's always the most vulnerable populations who are the greatest bearers of the consequences of things like climate change. So it's going to be BIPOCs, women, people in the LGBTQI plus community, basically people who have historically felt and who have historically been marginalized and silenced, they always face all of these consequences tenfold or even more. The why of it is multi-layered. So a lot of times, for example, in the global south, in countries that do not have the same socioeconomic status as other countries, these are places that don't necessarily have the funding or the infrastructure to combat climate change. Places like Boston have been praised because they're large cities in the United States that have built climate change, like weatherproof walls and things to respond to climate related issues. That's not a privilege that a lot of people in the global south have. A lot of them don't even have access to free media, and a lot of them don't have access to science and information on what is actually happening to them. So that is one aspect of it. Another is that they don't have the same ability to stand up for themselves. So a lot of times, because the history of the United States and housing here has been so redlined and so racist in the ways that our cities and suburbs have been built, and a lot of times the communities that are less socioeconomically well off and primarily comprised of BIPOCs, those are the ones that have less access to resources like clean and safe drinking water or even affordable drinking water. They are going to face more of the impacts of climate change than people who are well off and already have this existing infrastructure. So again, it's all these different groups that have historically been vulnerable and marginalized who are going to face the brunt of it. Another huge group is children. So back in UNICEF, we talked about how climate change impacts children all the time and infinitely more than adults. So when we think about babies and children, for example, their lungs are significantly smaller than adults. So it also depends on the size and how old the child is, but of course, so for a baby, on average, they estimate that for every single breath that an adult takes, a baby takes 4 breaths. So that means that if you have air that is extremely polluted and extremely dangerous to breathe in, a baby is breathing it in 4 times more than an adult is. And not only that, but children and babies are still developing, and they are breathing in and taking in all this pollution, all these bad particles from their environments, and that is impacting how they develop and grow in the long term. So it's affecting young people, it's affecting children. And the reality is about how it's affecting children, young people, and babies is that we are inheriting this earth. A lot of decision makers are on the older side. A lot of them are not going to be here decades from now when climate change continues to get worse. So we are the greatest stakeholders in the climate change space. And it's increasingly important that we stand up and talk about how this is affecting us and how it's going to continue affecting future generations because of all these factors.
Huh. And just really quickly, just to define it for the audience and for myself, what exactly are BIPOCs?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for asking. So BIPOC is essentially the latest, newest, most accepted. So BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, and it's still not perfect. Other people suggested other terms to use, but as of right now, it's the widely accepted quote unquote best term to describe it. So it's the idea that people of color, it's a way to describe people of color, but to also highlight that people who are Black and Indigenous don't face different barriers that other people of color might not. So for example, I'm an Asian woman, but I face a lot of barriers as an Asian woman, but I know for a fact that on average, what I face is not to the same level as somebody who is Black or somebody who is Indigenous or both faces too. So it's recognizing the intersectionality within our community and highlighting that the struggle that they face because they are Black and Indigenous within the people of color space.
Okay, thank you for defending that. Moving on to the next question. So how would you say, we'd love to hear your opinion on why would you believe it's important for everyone to understand the connection between human health and environmental health, and how maybe they work together inversely, or just their relationship in general?
Our environment shapes us, Cynthia. Like it is, I kind of touched upon this in my previous answer, but even just the air that we breathe, that is affecting how we develop in the future. Very famous American climate activist, Alexandria Villaseñor, who I've had the privilege of working with in the past, she developed asthma because of the air quality in her hometown. A lot of young people in Generation Z have developed asthma and other lung-related issues because of the air quality. When you have even our drinking water, when there's lead in the pipes and it's unsafe to drink water, which is a basic human need, and lead poisoning can have lasting impacts. It can lead you to, it can impact your brain functions. It can impact how you grow. It is just, our environment is quite literally one of the biggest factors in how we grow up and how we succeed in life. So understanding that the environment and environmental health in general directly correlates with human health is incredibly important. I mean, just thinking about at UNICEF, each March was known as World Water Month. And we would always talk about what a privilege it is to be able to walk up to a sink and just fill up our water bottles or fill up a glass and just drink straight from that. In a lot of other places, a child has to walk on average 5 miles a day just for water that might not even be clean or safe to drink. So can you imagine just walking up to a tap, or a world where you don't get to walk up to a tap, or where you walk up to a tap and the water is unsafe, which has happened and continues to happen every day in the United States. But I just ensuring that we have a clean and safe earth is ensuring that we have clean and safe environments for us to grow up in and for us to continue to survive and thrive in. So they're directly correlated, and I mean, everybody on this call is an environmental activist. So thank you for your commitment to not only environmental health, but also human health because of this.
Great, thank you. And I think that is going to conclude our section of kind of like just prescribed questions. And I'd like to open the floor to the audience to express their concerns to you or ask any questions that they might have. So if you'd like to type your questions into the chat or raise your hand, we'd love to hear from you, to the audience.
Yeah, I already have one question. This is Nora again from the beginning of the call. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much to both Cynthias for this amazing discussion. I hope you all enjoyed it and learned a lot. And I'm so excited to see what you all have to ask. There are a couple of ways, like I said earlier, you are welcome to put your questions into the chat, or if you would like to raise your hand. I saw a couple of you raising your hand. Yes, that is so true. Raising your hands throughout the discussion. If you'd like to do that now, I'll let you have the opportunity to unmute yourselves and ask Miss Yue your question. But first, from Odessa Hot, question for you, Cynthia, is what are some solutions to the climate crisis that you have your eye on currently? Often we talk about reducing fossil fuel emissions, driving less, using less water, and so forth. But are there any solutions you think are promising that might not be commonly considered?
Odessa, that is such a good question. So I think some of the greatest solutions are the ones that you've talked about, which is because those tackle the largest industries that are the largest CO2 emissions industries. Some other things to consider too are just, I mean, I was watching a video on this earlier, but just tiny homes or just homes that are more sustainable. I mean, when we think about the quote unquote American dream used to be having a large house and everything. But the reality is that's terrible for the environment. And just not only building something so large that you probably don't even need, just so unnecessarily large and using all those resources, but the continued upkeep of it, having to clean it all the time or heating and air and using air conditioning in it all the time, that is so terrible for the environment. So thinking about what we can do to create more sustainable living spaces is another thing that I think that we can think about. And then also, I feel like not even driving less, but just having better public infrastructure for public transportation. I was just in Europe. I just got back a few days ago, actually, and it is sometimes really embarrassing, honestly, being in Europe and thinking about even, I mean, I'm Asian, so I've been to Asia too, and their public transportation systems in some places are just so mind-blowingly amazing. You can get almost anywhere without having to drive. And so that's not only, it not only contributes to a better economy and giving people more access to things that they need, but also just in general, it helps us reduce emissions because people don't need to drive all the time. Also, just this is very relevant given that we've been through this for the past couple of years, but working from home. I mean, a lot of people working from home now don't need to have a car or don't need to travel as much. And that does really great things for the environment. And there are actually modern day homestead acts where they will quite literally, a city will give you $10,000, for example, or a large sum of money or even free land for you to move there and work from home, because that is actually just something that you can do now and it works. So yeah, I'm not sure if those are the most creative solutions, but they're just some things that I can think off the top of my head. Every small step counts towards our larger goal. But that's such a great question. And Odessa, if you have any ideas too, would love to see them in the chat.
Okay, that was amazing. And that, the tiny home part, I haven't even thought of that and like the impact that that has on the environment. And, I've been doing environmentalism work for a couple of years now. So it's just amazing how like through these conversations, you can just learn things constantly. And from Myra Rios, what are some questions you ponder that drive your environmental agenda?
Some of the things that I ponder a lot and this is going to relate back to a previous point that I made, but I think the most important one is, who am I talking to? Who's my audience? With people like y'all, I feel like I can just be myself and really share how I feel. With people who, and a little background about me is that I grew up in Tennessee, in a very, very conservative town where people didn't necessarily, I'm not saying everyone didn't, but many people didn't necessarily trust science in the same way. So thinking about, how do I change my arguments to tailor to the people that I'm talking to make them see that this is something that matters to them too. So for example, I mean, quite literally, sometimes I would even quote from the Bible on why it's important to protect the environment. And that would resonate with them because that is something that they value and something that they care about. The first thing I always ask myself when I'm in an advocacy space is, who is my audience? Who is the decision maker? And what matters to them? And how can I tailor what I want to say to resonate with them so that action actually happens? So that's one thing. And then another thing is, what is the most effective way to get this done? Because the reality is that there's so many different ways to activate on climate action, but there's only a limited amount of time that I have to be able to be an activist. So how can I make the largest impact with the limited time and resources, because I'm a broke cow, the limited time and resources that I have. And sometimes, at least for me, I really care about policy. So whether it's just looking at the most effective policies and introducing them to our leaders, or just listening to young people just like y'all and hearing about what solutions you have or what you think. It's really things like that that really I ponder the most, but of course that it differs for every single person. And certainly we need people in every single space to think creatively too. So Yeah.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. That's a very good point about considering the perspectives and backgrounds of everyone who you're communicating with. I don't see any questions currently in the chat, but I do remember, Taylor, you had your hand raised earlier. Do you have a question that you would like to ask?
Oh, I think Taylor had to leave.
Oh my goodness. Well, Junid, I also saw that you had your hand raised earlier.
I got it. I got it already, my answer. But I had like, I want to say like, I have a question. It isn't like question, but it's my personal experience. Like I had a like car accident like 8 months ago, and I'm stuck in home, and I don't take like, like fresh air, and like, is it like affect me also, like environmental effect for my body, my mentally, physically. So what do you guys have a like Cynthia, like you have any solution like that? Like how can I like, not only for me, like it's a lot of people is like this situation. So how can they get their like good health, environmental life?
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing that up. So a few thoughts before answering your question directly is I think that it touches upon a previous question that other Cynthia asked, which was who are the greatest people who are going to brunt climate change's consequences. And it's also people who are in situations like yours, Jeanette, who don't have the ability to access fresh air and stuff like that. So just thank you so much for highlighting your experience and for talking about how it's personally impacted you. To answer your question directly, in full transparency, I don't know if I'm the best person qualified to answer that, simply because I could give suggestions like going near a window and just opening it and sitting there and trying to breathe in the fresh air as much as you can. But I also don't know what your space looks like right now or whether that's possible. But I would definitely say, especially being somebody from UVA, if you can reach out to somebody at the services at your university and see if they have suggestions, or even see if you have peers who can help support you as you go out. But yeah, unfortunately, I'm so sorry. I don't know if I'm the best
Oh, no,
person.
it's fine. Thank you so much. But yeah, I know, but it's a tough, like not only for me, it's like I saw that a lot of people is happening, and this, yeah, this is going on. And especially in New York City, we don't have a like this kind of, like it's very small, tiny house. And some people live like one house, like one roommate or something, so it's a very tough. And right now I'm more better. Thanks God I'm alive. It's a big accident. But yeah, I go sometime, I can go some place like a park or somewhere, but sometimes I can't because of my injury, so is it like very difficult, and it makes me very worse. Like when you don't take your fresh oxygen or air, it's make you very uncomfortable. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely understand. Well, I'm glad that in the grand scheme of things, you are still here with us. I know that my mother was in a really terrible car accident a few years ago too, and it left her permanently disabled. So I'm glad that you are in the grand scheme of things okay. And same with my mother. I'm glad that despite her being permanently disabled, she's still here with us on this earth. But I completely understand it is such a hard situation to be in. And definitely, like, even if you have to stay indoors all the time, even getting an air purifier, for example, to help with the situation indoors. Yeah, I'm so sorry to hear that this is what you're experiencing.
No, thank you. I'm so sorry for your mom.
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, it happened several years ago, so it's definitely something that we've made peace with, but yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
That was amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your experience, both of you. I do not see any more questions in the chat, so if no one minds, I might pop in with my own. I wanted to ask that about, with the continual rise of climate change, how will those in disproportionate environments be impacted health-wise by the climate crisis?
So can you repeat, so with the continued rise of?
Yeah. With the continual rise of climate change, how will those in disproportionate environments, so like for instance, the global south, we've talked about them, be impacted, like have their healths impacted by the climate crisis? Like, can you give like examples of how this will hurt them?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Nora, oh my gosh, it's one of those things where I can't even begin to comprehend everything that's going to happen as climate change continues to exacerbate, because there are things that we can't even predict. I mean, people in the global south, I remember when I was at the UN General Assembly, I met so many young climate activists who were from the global south. One of them is from an indigenous tribe in the Arctic. He was 9 years old, and he said that in the span of 5 months, he had lost 9 friends to climate-related causes because they had fallen through the ice. It had melted away and they didn't know where it was safe to walk anymore. This is a young indigenous boy from the Arctic. I met another young person who was from the Pacific Islands, and he told me that his home had been completely wiped away because of an extreme storm, that had never happened before. And it just completely devastated his entire community. And even here in the United States, at the beginning of my term, I conducted a listening tour, and I went around and I just listened to what people in our generation thought. And there was this one person who shared with me that in his hometown of Iowa, this middle USA heartland state, he told me that they had experienced the worst flood in over 1,000 years. And to this day, this was back in 2008, and to this day, he said that the streets still smell like the flood. You still see damage from the flood. And the thing is the impacts of climate change have happened to our generation, and they're just going to continue to get worse. We're going to start seeing more children falling through the ice, children who are from vulnerable indigenous communities. We're going to see more people from small island states see their homes completely wiped away and maybe not even have an island to live on anymore. And we're going to see more extreme weather patterns that are flooding our cities here in the United States and across the globe. Things are going to exacerbate, things are going to get worse, and the reality is that things are going to happen that we can't even predict. This wasn't really, to my knowledge, climate related, but back when the tsunami happened in Japan about a decade ago, they had the tsunami, but then because of the tsunami, one of their nuclear power plants completely exploded. And to this day, there's still nuclear dust and nuclear waste and just the impacts of that nuclear explosion everywhere in that city in Japan. Imagine if that happened again, not just in Japan, but here in the United States, where nuclear energy is widely used around places, around many cities. Imagine if that happened anywhere else. You now have this awful problem where there are quite literally cities that need to be evacuated and can't be inhabited for decades later, just because of an extreme weather occurrence. So again, there are things that we can't predict, and there are things that have happened that are just going to get worse.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. Those are all amazing points. And of course, the Flint water crisis, for example, too. I mean, and that was a predominantly Black community, and how, I mean, still to this day, people buy their water in bottles because the water still isn't back to normal, or they just don't trust the government. There are just so many heartbreaking ways that people are going to be impacted. So we have a couple of minutes left. Actually, we have 1 minute left. But Myra just asked her question, and Junid has raised his hand as well. So if it's okay with everyone else, I would like to get to the both of them. But the event is just about wrapped up, so I'm not going to require that you stay on. But first, Myra Rios asked, how can marginalized groups who may not have access to the necessary resources contribute to climate sustainability? I think that's a very good question.
Yeah, it can be something as simple as just being more sustainable with your everyday actions. I mean, being able to be an activist does require some privilege. Somebody who has to work from 12 for from the morning, like somebody who has to basically get up at the break of dawn and work and get home at the end of the day when it's still dark outside does not have the same privilege to stand up and participate in a march as somebody who might have an hour or two free every single day. So I totally understand that question. And there, again, being an activist does require privileges, even being able to have a device where you can go onto social media and talk about these issues. That's a privilege too. So definitely they're acknowledging that is important. But I think that the smallest thing that you can do, you don't have to be the voice. You don't have to be the person who's marching out. A lot of times you don't even have the privilege to be that. But you can make small steps in your own daily life to talk about or to make climate action a reality in your individual life. So whether it's just having a conversation with somebody at school or at work, or doing small things like using less water when you shower, turning off the lights and just using less power. That's not only saving yourself money, but it's also doing good for the environment. So I'm sure there are a multitude of other ways that you can live more sustainably too, but those are just a few things off the top of my head. Or even when you are gifting things to other people too, making homemade gifts or recycling, repurposing something and creating art out of something that would have become trash. That's something that is saving money and resources, but also repurposing something into something new that might be meaningful to somebody else. So like I said, those are just a few things, but there are definitely other resources and ways that provide more information on being sustainable at an individual level. But certainly, Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield always says that her goal isn't to change the world, it's to change one person's mind. And so if you can do something as little as changing somebody's mind, even if it's your own, you've already made the first step in creating a larger movement.
That's beautiful. I especially loved that closing point you made about changing someone's mind. So last, I would like to give Janet another opportunity to speak. I saw you had your hand raised.
Yeah, it's a similar question, so I got it. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, it's now 8:02, so I thank all of you for staying on a little bit later. But that wraps up our discussion. So thank you to all of you who attended tonight. I hope this conversation was very edifying to you. Another thank you to Miss Cynthia Yue for this for offering her time to meet with us. It's such an honor. But that is it for all of us. So thank you again and have a good night.
Thank you. And please, everyone, pray for my country. It's a lot of flood right now, and especially my city where I was born. So yeah, thank you so much.